She was just looking for a quiet place to rest her aching feet at a billionaire's gala. But when Harley woke up, she was tangled in the sheets with the city's most ruthless mafia boss, and instead of a bullet, his entire empire was suddenly bowing at her feet. Harley Hayes was not built for the glittering, high-stakes world of New York's elite. At 220 pounds, with thick thighs, a soft stomach, and generous curves she usually kept hidden beneath oversized cardigans and comfortable aprons, she felt entirely out of place in the sleek, plunging burgundy velvet gown her best friend, Fiona, had forced her into. Harley was a pastry chef who spent her days dusted in flour and smelling of vanilla extract. She preferred the quiet predictability of her bakery in Queens over the suffocating opulence of high society. But Fiona, a ruthless social climber and fiercely loyal friend, had somehow secured 2 coveted invitations to the infamous Castiglione Winter Gala. "You need to get out of the kitchen, Pen," Fiona had declared earlier that evening, aggressively applying a second coat of ruby-red lipstick to Harley's mouth. "Dominic Castiglione is hosting. The man is a literal billionaire, a ghost in the society pages, and allegedly deeply involved in, well, things we don't ask about. The city's most powerful men will be there. You are going to mingle, drink expensive champagne, and remember that you are a catch." Now, standing in the cavernous, chandelier-lit ballroom of the sprawling Castiglione estate on Long Island, Harley felt like anything but a catch. The room was a sea of sharp angles, size 0 models in backless silk, hedge fund managers with predatory smiles, and silent, broad-shouldered security men wearing tailored suits and earpieces. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, white truffles, and dangerous money. Within 20 minutes, Fiona had abandoned her to flirt with a handsome heir to a shipping conglomerate, leaving Harley standing awkwardly near a towering ice sculpture of a griffin. Her feet, crammed into torturous 4-inch stilettos, were screaming in agony. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her thighs chafing slightly under the heavy velvet of her dress. The noise of the string quartet, blending with hundreds of overlapping, pretentious conversations, was giving her a blinding headache. "I just need 5 minutes," Harley thought desperately, scanning the room for a quiet corner. 5 minutes to sit down in the dark and take these damn shoes off. Hoping to find a guest bathroom or a secluded lounge, Harley slipped out of the ballroom through a pair of heavy mahogany doors. The thumping bass of the gala immediately muffled, replaced by the hushed, almost reverent silence of the mansion's interior corridors. She walked down a long hallway, lined with classical oil paintings and antique vases that probably cost more than her entire bakery. She didn't realize she had bypassed a discreet velvet rope, nor did she notice that the normally heavily guarded east wing was temporarily vacant. Outside the estate, a minor security breach at the perimeter gates had drawn the guards away from their indoor posts. Harley turned a corner, completely lost in the labyrinthine mansion. The hallway here was darker, illuminated only by low-lit sconces casting shadows against the blood-red damask wallpaper. At the very end of the hall stood a massive set of double doors, intricately carved with roaring lions. "There has to be a chair in here," she muttered to herself, pushing the heavy brass handle. To her surprise, it clicked open effortlessly. Harley slipped inside and closed the doors behind her, plunging herself into near darkness. Moonlight filtered through massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a bedroom that was roughly the size of her entire apartment. The decor was masculine and imposing. Dark oak paneling, a roaring fireplace that had died down to glowing embers, and in the center of the room, a colossal California king bed draped in charcoal grey silk and a thick fur throw. She didn't care whose room it was. She limped over to the edge of the bed and practically collapsed onto the mattress. The sheer softness of it drew a soft, involuntary moan from her lips. She reached down, unbuckling the straps of her stilettos, and kicked them off. The relief that washed over her aching arches was intoxicating. Harley laid back, intending to just rest her eyes for a moment. The bed smelled incredibly masculine, a heady mix of expensive bourbon, cedarwood, and a faint metallic tang she couldn't quite place. It was comforting, grounding. The velvet gown was suffocating her, so she reached around and unzipped it halfway, letting her body breathe. Just 10 minutes, she promised herself, sinking deeper into the sea of silk pillows. Then I'll find Fiona and go home to my cat. But the exhaustion of the week, combined with the 2 glasses of vintage champagne she had consumed on an empty stomach, pulled her under. Within seconds, the plus-size baker was fast asleep in the private sanctuary of the most feared Mafia boss on the eastern seaboard. At 3 a.m., Dominic Castiglione returned to his estate. He did not look like the pristine billionaire host his guests downstairs believed him to be. The gala was still raging in the West Wing, but Dominic had spent his evening at the Brooklyn Naval Yards, violently negotiating a territorial dispute with the Russian syndicate. His knuckles were bruised and split, and there was a streak of dried blood on his crisp white collar that didn't belong to him. Dominic was 34, standing at 6'4", with shoulders built like a fortress and eyes as cold and dark as obsidian. He was exhausted down to his marrow. His second-in-command, Lorenzo Rossi, flanked him as they walked down the silent East Wing corridor. "The Russians agreed to the new tax, boss," Lorenzo murmured, adjusting his suit jacket to conceal his shoulder holster. "But Matteo Russo is making moves in Queens. He's trying to find a weak point. We intercepted a drone scouting the perimeter tonight." "Let Russo play his games," Dominic rasped, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If he steps out of line, I'll burn his empire to the ground. Have the perimeter doubled. No one gets in or out of this wing without my say-so." "Understood. Get some rest, Dom." Dominic nodded curtly, pushing open the heavy carved doors of his bedroom. He didn't bother turning on the lights. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, navigated the familiar shadows. He shed his suit jacket, letting it drop to the Persian rug. He tore off his ruined tie, unbuttoned his shirt, and stepped out of his slacks, left only in his boxer briefs. His chest and arms were a canvas of sprawling, dark tattoos, a testament to the brutal life he had survived and conquered. He pulled back the thick fur throw and slid into the bed, craving the cold emptiness of his sheets. Instead, his knee brushed against something warm, something soft. Instinct, honed by years of surviving assassination attempts, kicked in instantly. Dominic's hand shot out, moving with terrifying speed to the nightstand to grab his suppressed Sig Sauer. His muscles coiled, ready to strike, ready to kill the intruder. But then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic breathing, a delicate, sleepy sigh. Dominic froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. He leaned over, his eyes adjusting to the moonlight spilling across the mattress. Tangled in his dark sheets was a woman. She was lying on her side, facing away from him. Dominic's breath hitched. Women in his world were carefully curated, sharp-edged socialites, calculating assassins, or paid companions who were as thin and fragile as spun glass. The woman in his bed was none of those things. She was lush, round, and remarkably soft. Her thick thighs were exposed where her burgundy dress had ridden up, and her bare back, smooth and pale, was visible where the dress hung open. A wave of confusion washed over him, quickly followed by a primal, uncharacteristic possessiveness. Had Lorenzo sent her? No. Lorenzo knew Dominic despised strangers in his personal space. Had she wandered in from the gala? The metallic smell of blood on his own skin was suddenly overpowered by the scent radiating from her. Warm vanilla and powdered sugar. It was the most innocent, intoxicating smell he had ever encountered. Dominic slowly lowered the gun, placing it back on the nightstand. His adrenaline faded, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. He should wake her up. He should interrogate her, find out who she was and how she bypassed his security. Instead, completely out of character, the ruthless Don shifted closer. The sheer warmth radiating from her plush figure was magnetic. Without thinking, Dominic reached out. His large, heavily tattooed arm draped heavily over her waist, pulling her thick, curved body flush against his hard, scarred chest. She fit perfectly against him, filling the empty spaces he hadn't known were there. Harley murmured in her sleep, wiggling backward slightly until her soft hips pressed firmly against him. Dominic closed his eyes, burying his face in the messy tangle of her hair. For the first time in 10 years, the Don of the Castiglione family fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The awakening. At 7 a.m., crisp winter sunlight pierced the gap in the heavy curtains. Harley woke up slowly, her mind foggy. The bed felt incredibly comfortable, far too comfortable to be her lumpy mattress in Queens. And her apartment was never this quiet. Then she felt the weight. A massive, heavy arm was slung across her stomach, pinning her firmly in place. Harley's eyes snapped open. Her heart skyrocketed into her throat. She slowly, agonizingly, looked down. The arm holding her was corded with thick muscle, covered in a sleeve of intricate black ink. Skulls, ravens, and a large, imposing crown on the forearm. Oh my God. Oh my God. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced her chest. Harley carefully turned her head. Sleeping peacefully beside her was the most terrifyingly handsome man she had ever seen. He had sharp, aristocratic cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with dark stubble, and a small, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked like a fallen angel. He also looked like he could snap her neck with 2 fingers. Memories of the night before flooded back. The gala, the quiet hallway, the huge bed. She had slept in a stranger's bed. Not just any stranger. Dominic Castiglione. Fiona had warned her. A ghost in the society pages. A terrifying reality in the underworld. Harley tried to hold her breath. She had to get out. She had to leave before he woke up and realized a 220-pound baker had broken into his inner sanctum. She reached down with trembling fingers, attempting to gently lift his heavy arm off her waist. It was like trying to lift an anvil. As she moved him an inch, Dominic let out a low, sleepy growl and instinctively tightened his grip, pulling her flush against his broad chest again. His massive hand splayed across her soft stomach, holding her captive. Harley squeezed her eyes shut, tears of sheer terror pricking the corners. I am going to die. I am going to die in a velvet dress on Long Island. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the bedroom clicked open. Harley's eyes flew wide open. Walking into the room was a severe-looking older woman in a crisp maid's uniform, Mrs. Harrington, the head housekeeper. Right behind her was Lorenzo, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, carrying a silver tray with an espresso pot, followed by two massive security guards, armed with assault rifles slung across their chests. They stepped into the room, Lorenzo speaking quietly. "Boss, we have a situation with—" Lorenzo stopped dead in his tracks. Mrs. Harrington gasped, nearly dropping the silver tray. The two guards froze, their hands hovering near their weapons. The four of them stared at the bed. There was their ruthless, bloodthirsty Don, sleeping soundly, completely shirtless, holding a terrified, plus-size woman in a half-unzipped burgundy gown, as if she were his most prized possession. Harley felt the blood drain from her face. She was caught. She scrambled, violently shoving Dominic's arm off her. This time, the sudden movement woke him. Dominic's eyes snapped open, instantly alert, dark and lethal. Harley practically fell out of the bed, clutching the bodice of her dress to her chest, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She was hyperventilating. I'm so sorry," Harley stammered, her voice shaking violently as she backed away toward the window. "I was just tired. My feet hurt. I didn't mean to trespass. I swear I didn't touch anything. Please don't call the police. Please." Dominic sat up slowly. The silk sheets pooled at his waist, putting his heavily scarred, muscular torso on full display. He didn't look at Lorenzo. He didn't look at the guards. His dark, intense gaze was locked entirely on Harley. He took in her flushed, panicked face, the soft curve of her shoulders, the trembling of her thick thighs. Lorenzo, recovering from his shock, looked from the terrified woman to his boss. In the Mafia world, entering the Don's private chamber uninvited was a guaranteed death sentence. But Lorenzo also noticed something else. Dominic wasn't reaching for his gun. In fact, Dominic looked furious that she was standing so far away from the bed. Lorenzo was a survivor, and he knew how to read a room. If the boss had let this woman sleep in his arms all night, she wasn't an intruder. She was hers. Harley squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the guards to grab her, waiting for the violence Fiona had warned her about. Instead, Lorenzo cleared his throat, stood impeccably straight, and bowed his head deeply. Taking the cue, Mrs. Harrington immediately bowed at the waist. The two terrifying, heavily armed guards snapped to attention and bowed their heads in perfect synchronization. "Good morning, Mom," Lorenzo said, his voice ringing with absolute, unwavering respect. "We apologize for the intrusion." Harley's eyes snapped open, her jaw dropping in sheer disbelief. She looked at the bowing staff, then back to the man in the bed. Dominic didn't correct them. A dark, predatory smirk slowly curved his lips. "Lorenzo," Dominic said, his voice a rich, commanding baritone that sent a shiver down Harley's spine. "Lock down the estate. Matteo Russo's drone footage from last night was just decoded, wasn't it?" Lorenzo nodded, still keeping his head respectfully lowered. "Yes, boss. The drone caught footage through the east windows. Russo's men know there is a woman in your private wing. They think she's your weakness." Harley's heart stopped. "What?" Dominic finally broke his gaze from her and looked at Lorenzo. "Then Russo is a dead man. Put 50 men on the perimeter. Nobody touches my queen." For the next 72 hours, Harley Hayes did not leave the Castiglione estate. The sprawling Long Island mansion became a luxurious, terrifying fortress. Dominic's words, "Nobody touches my queen," had triggered a protocol that transformed the property into a militarized zone. Black SUVs patrolled the wrought iron gates, and men in tailored Brioni suits with concealed Glocks stood near every exit. Harley was relocated from the guest wing to Dominic's private suite. Her bruised, cheap stilettos and burgundy velvet dress were discarded, replaced by a wardrobe curated overnight by a frantic personal shopper from Bergdorf Goodman. Silk robes, cashmere loungewear, and custom La Perle lingerie, all meticulously sized to flatter her 220-pound frame, filled the mahogany closets. For a woman used to flour-dusted leggings and oversized aprons, the sheer opulence was dizzying, but the luxury could not mask the reality. She was a prisoner. On the third afternoon, claustrophobia and anxiety drove Harley out of the master suite. She ignored the 2 armed guards at her door, padding barefoot down the grand staircase in a plush emerald green robe that clung beautifully to her generous hips and thick thighs. She needed grounding. She needed the one thing that made sense in her chaotic existence: baking. She found her way to the estate's industrial kitchen, a gleaming paradise of stainless steel, outfitted with a commercial-grade Hobart mixer, dual Wolf ovens, and a walk-in pantry that rivaled a Michelin-starred restaurant. The head chef, a stern Frenchman named Laurent, looked horrified when Harley tied a linen towel around her waist and demanded flour, European butter, and heavy cream. But a sharp nod from Lorenzo, who was always lurking in the shadows, ensured she got whatever she wanted. Within an hour, the intimidating, sterile kitchen smelled like warm vanilla, toasted pecans, and browned butter. Harley was in her element. Her anxiety melted away as she kneaded dough, her soft arms flexing, her body moving with a rhythmic, practiced grace. She didn't notice when the kitchen staff quietly filtered out. She didn't notice when the heavy oak doors swung open. Dominic Castiglione stood in the doorway, mesmerized. He had spent the last 3 days orchestrating a brutal offensive against the Russo syndicate, dismantling their supply lines in Brooklyn. He was running on black coffee and vengeance. But seeing Harley here, her face flushed with heat, a smudge of flour on her cheek, stopped him dead. The women he usually encountered were calculating, starving themselves for perfection, weaponizing their beauty. Harley was entirely different. She was warm, authentic, and breathtakingly soft. The emerald robe hugged the deep curve of her waist and the lush fullness of her chest. She looked like a Renaissance painting brought to life in his sterile world. "You are making a mess of my kitchen," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Harley gasped, nearly dropping a tray of brioche. She whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dominic was out of his suit, wearing just a tight black t-shirt that showcased his sprawling tattoos and dark slacks. He looked exhausted, yet impossibly dangerous. "I needed to do something," Harley said defensively, wiping her floury hands on the towel. "I run a bakery in Queens. Sugar and crumb. I can't just sit in a gilded cage all day waiting for a mobster to kill me." Dominic crossed the room slowly, his predatory grace making the large kitchen feel suffocatingly small. He stopped inches from her. The height difference was staggering. Harley had to tilt her head all the way back to meet his dark, obsessive gaze. "Matteo Russo will never touch you," Dominic promised, reaching up to brush the smudge of flour from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was shockingly gentle for a man with such violent hands. "But you need to understand why he is hunting you." Harley swallowed hard. "Because of the drone? Because they think I'm your girlfriend." "Because of your friend, Fiona," Dominic corrected softly. Harley froze. "What?" Dominic pulled a sleek iPad from his slacks, tapping the screen before handing it to her. It was a surveillance photo taken outside a dimly lit bar in Manhattan. There was Fiona, laughing, handing a manila envelope to a man with a distinct snake tattoo on his neck. Fiona is severely in debt to a loan shark tied to the Russo family, Dominic explained coldly. They offered her a deal. Bring an unknown +1 to my gala, leave her in the unmonitored East Wing, and text them the coordinates. They needed a distraction to bypass my security. You were the bait, Harley. She sold you out to pay her debts. The breath left Harley's lungs. Fiona, her closest confidant, the woman who had forced her into that velvet dress, had handed her over to the Mafia. The betrayal stung worse than the fear. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over her thick lashes. Dominic's jaw clenched. He hated the tears. He reached out, his massive hands gripping her soft hips, pulling her thick, curved body flush against his rock-hard frame. She is dead to you now, he whispered fiercely against her hair. You belong to this house. You belong to me. And I protect what is mine. The illusion of safety shattered exactly 24 hours later. It was midnight. Dominic had left the estate for a clandestine meeting with the 5 families at a warehouse in the meat-packing district, intending to negotiate a ceasefire regarding the docks. He had left 50 men guarding the perimeter, assuring Harley she was perfectly safe. Harley was in the master suite, wrapped in a thick duvet, mindlessly watching a cooking show on the massive flat-screen television. The absolute silence of the mansion was suddenly violently interrupted by a massive explosion that shook the very foundation of the estate. The television cut to black. The lights flickered and died. Emergency red backup lights bathed the hallway in a sinister, bloody glow. Harley scrambled out of bed, her heart practically vibrating in her throat. Gunfire, rapid and deafening, erupted from the front lawn. Shouting echoed up the grand staircase. Matteo Russo hadn't waited for the negotiations. He had launched a full-scale assault on the Castiglione stronghold while Dominic was away. The bedroom doors burst open. Lorenzo sprinted into the room, an M4 carbine rifle clutched in his hands, his usually immaculate suit covered in drywall dust. "Ma'am, we have to move, now!" Lorenzo barked, grabbing her arm. "Russo's men breached the south gate with a vehicle bomb. They are swarming the lower levels." "Where do we go?" Harley cried out, struggling to keep up, as Lorenzo dragged her down a hidden servants' corridor she hadn't known existed. Her bare feet slapped against the cold stone floor. "The panic room in the sub-basement," Lorenzo replied, checking his corners with deadly precision. "The boss is 5 minutes away. We just need to hold them off." They navigated the dark, narrow stairwell, the sounds of combat growing louder. As they reached the kitchen level, the heavy oak doors splintered inward. 3 men in tactical gear, armed with submachine guns, spilled into the hallway, cutting off their path to the basement. "Get down!" Lorenzo yelled, shoving Harley behind a heavy marble pillar before opening fire. The deafening roar of gunfire filled the confined space. Harley clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as marble chips and plaster rained down on her. She was a baker, a woman who worried about proofing times and buttercream consistency, not ballistic trajectories. She peeked around the pillar. Lorenzo had dropped 2 of the attackers, but the 3rd had managed to flank him. A bullet grazed Lorenzo's shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor, his rifle clattering out of reach. The remaining gunman raised his weapon, aiming directly at Lorenzo's head. Adrenaline, pure and unadulterated, overrode Harley's paralyzing terror. She was not going to let this man die for her. She didn't have a weapon, but she knew this kitchen. She lunged from her hiding spot, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet that Laurel had left on the butcher block. With all her weight, utilizing the strength she had built from years of hauling 50-pound bags of flour, Harley swung the skillet like a baseball bat. Clang! The heavy iron connected squarely with the side of the gunman's helmet. The sickening crunch echoed in the hallway. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the floor. Harley stood there, panting heavily, her chest heaving under her silk nightgown, staring at the body in absolute shock. Lorenzo stared up at her from the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. "Nice swing, ma'am," Lorenzo wheezed. Before Harley could respond, the sound of helicopter rotors battered the air outside, rattling the windows. Floodlights illuminated the grounds. Dominic had arrived. The counter-assault was swift and merciless. Within 3 minutes, the remaining Rosso men were neutralized. The heavy front doors were kicked open, and Dominic stalked into the mansion. He looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate, covered in ash and someone else's blood, his eyes wild with a feral panic. "Harley!" he roared, his voice tearing through the chaotic mansion. "In the kitchen!" Lorenzo yelled back, struggling to his feet. Dominic rounded the corner, his gun raised. When he saw Harley standing over an unconscious gunman, clutching a cast-iron skillet, the lethal tension drained from his massive frame. He dropped his weapon. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He crossed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, crushing her into his chest. His hands frantically roamed over her back, her thick waist, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of vanilla that stubbornly clung to her skin. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking, pulling back to inspect her face. "Did they touch you?" "No," Harley gasped, her own tears finally falling as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "I'm okay. Lorenzo got hurt. I used a pan." Dominic looked at the unconscious man, then at the skillet in her hand, then back to her flushed, tear-stained face. A genuine, unrestrained laugh rumbled deep in his chest, a sound Lorenzo had not heard in a decade. "My queen," Dominic murmured reverently, pressing a fierce, bruised kiss to her forehead. "You are magnificent." The chaos of the night slowly faded into the dawn. Matteo Russo was dealt with personally by Dominic before the sun fully rose, permanently ending the turf war. The betrayal of Fiona was a wound that would take time to heal, but Harley found she no longer missed her old life as much as she thought she would. A week later, the Castiglione mansion was quiet again, but things had fundamentally changed. The East Wing was no longer a sullen tomb. It smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Harley stood in the industrial kitchen, wearing a custom-made silk apron over a beautiful curve-hugging dress. She was frosting a 3-tiered cake. Behind her, the heavy doors opened. Dominic walked in, looking immaculate in a charcoal suit, followed by Lorenzo, whose arm was in a sling. "The European syndicates have agreed to our terms, boss," Lorenzo was saying, reading from a tablet, "and the front companies are showing a 20% profit increase." "Good," Dominic said, walking up behind Harley. He wrapped his heavily tattooed arms around her thick waist, resting his chin on her shoulder, completely unbothered by Lorenzo's presence. "And the bakery?" Harley smiled, leaning back against his solid chest, holding up a piping bag. "The new location for Sugar and Crumb in Manhattan opens next week. The permit's cleared instantly. I wonder who made that happen." Dominic chuckled, pressing a kiss to her neck. "I only facilitate good business, Mia Regina. The rest is all you." Lorenzo closed his tablet, straightening his posture. He looked at the ruthless Mafia Don and the plus-size pastry chef who had somehow conquered him with a velvet dress and a cast-iron skillet. Lorenzo bowed his head deeply. "Will there be anything else, Don Castiglione?" "Boss Harley." Harley laughed, the sound warm and bright, echoing through the halls of the fortress. She turned in Dominic's arms, looking up into the eyes of the most dangerous man in New York, knowing she was the only thing that could bring him to his knees. "No, Lorenzo," Harley smiled, handing Dominic a freshly baked cannoli. "Everything is exactly right." Did Harley survive the dangerous underworld of the Castiglione family, or did she become the undisputed queen of the empire? The truth behind her accidental night with the Don changes everything. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life drama stories. Drop a comment below on what you would do in Harley's shoes. See you next time.